two, 1, 2, 3.
Hello and welcome to Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. I'm here today with Peter Wissoker. We will be talking about housing finances. Well, Peter, you and I often find one another in the same room, both of us arguing typically to the Industrial Development Agency, the IDA, that they should not give a property tax abatement to some developer of market rate or luxury housing in the city of Ithaca. My arguments are fairly common sense ones. I know that the city is very strapped for tax income, and I see how eagerly developers build in College Town where they don't get abatements. And I'll bet they would build downtown too, even if they knew there would not be abatements there. But you bring much more sophisticated arguments. Tell us about your background in housing finance, Peter Wissoker.
Well, some years ago as an undergraduate, or actually as a master's student, I was in a geography program working on an industrial geography project with a faculty member who had a grant to research a series of industries. And I was thinking, and she wanted something done in finance. So I thought, oh, great, banking would work spectacularly for my own interest because I'm a firm believer in following the money. But instead, she told me, there's too much work out there on banking already. We would prefer that you work on insurance instead. And I thought, oh, that's really the most boring thing in the world that I can think of. And yet, the more deeper I looked, the more I realized that actually life insurance companies are amongst the deepest pools of capital in the world. And so flash forward to, I don't know, about 20 years, let's say 20 or 30 years, and I entered a doctoral program with the idea that I would study insurance companies' interests in property and finance, since I was in the planning program here at Cornell. And I thought, in order to talk to people in life insurance companies about their investments, it would be best for me to actually take a bunch of classes in the real estate program. And so I did. And I took, I don't know, 3 to 5 classes. And as part of my dissertation, I focused really on how international capital played a role in different markets, real estate markets. I looked at how the idea of shareholder value influenced the home building industry and how that played into their use of subprime lending. And then I also looked at how life insurance companies changed their real estate investment strategies to more I don't know what you'd call it, to actually market making, forward thinking strategies as they were competing with other industries. And then finally, and maybe most appropriate to our discussion here, I looked at how planners traditionally ignore the role of large financial institutions when thinking about finance, when thinking about local development and local development policies, which is something we see here regularly in Ithaca, where people don't really think about who's funding the people that are coming to ask for tax abatements and the like.
Okay, so that quite a journey, I guess. Well, coming back again to more general questions. As I said, I live in College Town, and when I walk a couple of blocks, I see buildings, large and small, springing up all over the place. And I know that this is outside the area where the city has seen fit to dangle tax abatement incentives for building, but the developers and landlords build eagerly. So in some general terms, how do they typically finance their buildings?
I think generally they they have a pool of investors that they've attracted to come and invest in their projects. And then they put a little, it's like getting a mortgage where you also put a little bit of your own money in. And then between the money they raise from their investors and the money they put in themselves, they go to the bank and borrow the rest of it and show the bank that they expect to get X amount of annual revenue from rents that they charge the students, which are pretty high, and take it from there. I mean, the reason that they can find investors is because college towns over the last decade or so have become very hot real estate markets nationally that investors find that they're very steady places because generally there's the places like Ithaca, at least the number of students isn't going to shrink. And so it's a place with a good steady return. And they also know that it won't be that hard if the developer wants to sell the building for them to then make a handy profit out of the investment.
So some of this is just that they know that the university isn't going to move away the way,
Yeah.
let's say, a factory might.
That's right.
And then why would the situation be any different downtown?
That's an interesting question, Theresa. I think that it depends who you ask. I think that the people who work in city and county government believe that nobody would want to live downtown without lovely apartments, and they don't think anybody would want to build an apartment without having some sort of subsidy. But if you ask me, the same argument about it being a relatively hot property market still obtains downtown. So yeah, it could go either way, and it's a matter of your perspective.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think this is where this program CIITAP, Community Investment Incentive Tax Abatement Program, comes in, that has gotten us aroused many times to oppose it, or at least oppose some of it. And I guess I can talk a little bit about that history. It started early in the millennium when, as you say, with this belief that nobody would want to live in a city, that everybody wants to commute from a faraway suburb. But on the other hand, for environmental reasons, we want a more denser city environment. They started the downtown density program, and early in the millennium, there were several projects being built, 5 or 6 of them, including what's called Cayuga Green, for instance. cultivar and the parking garage and an apartment building or two. And then things changed a bit. Around 28, 29, it seemed that nothing was being built. I should say that I think a little earlier than that, things were going so swimmingly that the city started putting more requirements on the builders. And then nothing was built. And when Svante Myrick became mayor, they looked at that and said, oh dear, it's our fault. We put too many requirements on the builders, not paying any attention to the fact that after the bank collapses of 2008, 2009, there just wasn't capital around for building. I mean, it was a serious recession or even a depression. But to fix that, they pretty much eliminated all but, I think, 3 requirements. The assessed value of the property had to increase by at least $500,000. The building had to be at least 3 stories high, or else be the major restoration of an existing building. And the property had to be in the density district, or it had to redevelop a brownfield, a polluted site. And they also added a requirement that all properties of the developer had to comply with all city laws, regulations, code enforcement, be up to date on taxes and whatnot. That was a kind of covert way of saying they wouldn't give an abatement to a particularly noxious landlord known for all sorts of violations. And there have been some changes since then. The density district, which was originally just central downtown and I think the West State Street corridor, was expanded to include much of the waterfront. A local labor requirement was added to be enforced by requiring the developer to reach out to contractors and subcontractors, and also requiring that they submit the addresses of the actual workers on site, which by examining to see if the zip codes were either in Tompkins County or in one of the 6 adjacent counties, that would be considered local labor. There was a diversity and inclusion policy, but that was more for businesses rather than housing. And finally, in 2020, they added a workforce housing policy, which required either 20% of the units to be available for households earning 80% or less of AMI, area median income, or else that the developer contribute to the county's community housing development fund. If you look on the website of the IDA, you will see that that contribution is supposed to be $5,000 per unit in the actual building, not per affordable unit, not built, per unit in the actual building. And it still says that, though it has just recently been raised to $5,500. There is a lot of argument to be made around the number. And I don't know if you want to address that right now, the question of how much But remember, all this is because they are getting a tax abatement for reduced taxes for the first 7 years of operation or for the first 10 years of operation.
Yeah. What would I add? I mean, I think that policy or choice of policy seems fairly misguided, and in some ways seems like it's based, to me, this is always a kind of game, like the kids' game of chicken, where they're always worried that the developers are going to go away if they don't give the abatement, and so they always give the tax abatement to the developer rather than sort of staring down the developer and making the developer say, all right, we withdraw, in the way that the planning board not so long ago said to a developer, you need to make this building 1 floor smaller. And the developer listened and did it because they wanted approval for the project itself. I have some ideas on how to improve the abatement program. Would you be interested in that? Would
Sure.
this be good to talk about this?
Sure. Go ahead.
Well, there's, for instance, right now, along with the things you mentioned, there's a bar for financial need that developers can say, without the abatement, we're going to make less than 10% on an annual, what they call cash over cash, each year on the project. And to me, and therefore they need an abatement, So to me, it seems like they should lower that bar to 4 or 5%. So it's not so easy or in a sense, it's raising the bar. So it's not so easy for developers to say, we're not making enough money, because 10% on any investment is, on an annual basis, is pretty good money, I would say. And so I could see them, the city could say, well, show us you're making less than 5% if you want to cry poor over this. A second thing I would like to see is for them to shorten the schedule of abatements, because right now it's front loaded and they get a huge, sometimes people are getting a couple of $1 million out of the abatement, and that's costing the school district, and the school district is roughly half of the money that's lost. And the county and the city split the remainder of the money that's lost. The state loses some sales taxes as well. And that's spread out over 10 years, and the bulk of it is in the first 2 or 3 years. But I would like to see it go down, say they get an abatement for the first year, a big abatement for the first year, and then it's 50% in the second year, and then maybe 10% in the third year, if you're going to have an abatement at all. And then maybe you add another year or two in order to incentivize energy efficiency. Because to me, incentivizing energy efficiency isn't a bad thing in many ways. Another thing I would like to see, and this is where you and I are often talking about the same things to the IDA, is to eliminate abatements altogether for non-affordable housing or market level housing. And that would be really the most straightforward thing to do, to say, no, you don't get a tax break. And even though you say right now you're paying into an affordable housing pool, we'd rather just have the tax money to spend, and we can use that to spend on affordable housing as well. And if you're not going to do, if they don't want to do that, then at least they should strengthen the abatement policies to encourage developers to more affordable units in their buildings. In other words, to actually put the 20% units in their buildings rather than just paying $5,500 a unit into the housing fund with the hope that it will be leveraged. And that money is used, but it's usually not it's far from enough to build as much affordable housing as we need in the city and in the county. And and sort of the flip side of that is to dramatically increase the cost per unit developers are charged if they want to avoid including the units in the building themselves. And to me, that involves actually sorting out how much it would cost, like what they call replacement cost. So if you actually wanted to build the number of units that they're paying to offset, then let's see how much that actually would cost and charge the developers accordingly, rather than having them put a much smaller amount of money into a housing fund that then has to be leveraged with state money and other grant money in order to produce the housing. There's no reason they should get away with such a small contribution to the housing. I have some other ideas, or is that enough for now?
Well, let's see. I also heard complaints that that tax abatements affect land values, the cost of buying land to build.
Yeah, well, you can see how enabling large, if we talk about tax abatements primarily in terms of going to firms that are building market rate apartments, which are, where they're charging $3,000 for a studio apartment, say, for instance, then it makes sense that everything around those buildings, the price of those are going to go up because potential landlords, for instance, are going to want to build apartments or buy, even like down here in Fall Creek where I live, you could say, oh, if they can get $3,000 for an apartment, then surely I can do that too. And therefore I'm willing to pay more for a house that I can then rent out. And oddly and interestingly enough, I would say Yahoo Finance recently had a story about best place college towns to invest for single investors who just wanted an alternative place to invest, that featured Ithaca as one of the fine locales where you could get a house and then charge a good rent for it and make a good profit out of it. So that's a long answer to maybe a short question, but yes, it helps push the prices up, just because it makes everything around it seem to be, worth more. And I would be clear also that when we talk about tax abatements in this context, we're really talking about abatements for market rate apartments rather than abatements for affordable housing, which probably wouldn't have quite the same effect, I don't think. And one last thing while I'm prattling, is people will want to be on the lookout because the IDA is talking a lot about not using the term tax abatements anymore because they think it's ungainly and it gets people out with their proverbial pitchforks, as I think someone said, and that they're going to talk about tax incentives instead because it incentivizes builders to build in places where things need to be built. And it's worth remembering that the two are often linked and it's not an either or situation.
Right. And maybe we should actually go back to one very basic thing that we perhaps haven't mentioned, and that is that the IDA is the Industrial Development Agency. And the whole idea of those tax abatements originally were supposed to be for creating industrial jobs that would pay good wages. If people were paid enough, they would be able to afford a place to live.
Yes, completely agree.
And one thing that nobody really seems to look into is what are people being paid when they work in the city of Ithaca at jobs like restaurants and cleaning hotels, all those jobs that the tourism industry creates, which seems to have been replaced other industries here.
Well, they always say with Cornell, it's the people who have to drive the farthest, who have to get up earliest and drive through the most snow to get to work to
and so they can't use the buses that do exist and aren't sufficient anyway. And so we get a lot of, what should we say, excess driving to work and from work. And this is undoubtedly creating a lot of pollution and warming in its wake. Another question is how affordable housing can be built and financed. But I don't know if you want to, well, you said that perhaps tax abatements should be reserved only for low rent housing.
I think that's correct.
Yeah. I agree. So thank you, Peter Wissoker, for bringing a lot of financial background into these questions about tax abatements. This has been Ithaca DSA Presents. Thanks for watching.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.